Well, hello and welcome to today's bonus episode of Breaking the Taboo. And you've probably been reading the headlines and seen that there's been a lot about maternity in the news. This month, we did a special investigation with Channel 4 and New Statesman, looking at their investigation into Oxford University Hospitals Trust. And today, I'm delighted to have on the show Shaun Lintern, who is the health editor of the Sunday Times. They did a huge piece this month looking at ideology of birth and the natural birth movement and what the role is of the curriculum for midwives and what are the next generation being taught who'll be working in our hospitals. Well, Shaun, thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about this. And we decided to do a bit more of a news episode this month because the news really has been dominated by maternity now for several weeks. Although it's fair to say that you, as a journalist, have been following this for many years. I remember when I was the MP in Stafford, how you were tirelessly campaigning on behalf of constituents in the Shropshire and Telford scandals and many others in East Kent and other places. So perhaps I could start off by asking, what was the kind of headline findings of your investigation for the Sunday Times into maternity care?
Thanks, Theo, and thanks for having me on. I'm very happy to talk about this. And yeah, as you described, I'm sadly a little bit of a veteran of maternity scandal stories, sadly, and I've a long experience of writing about these. And as you mentioned, Shrewsbury and Telford, I think I first started writing about that 10 years ago. And I've cut my teeth on lots of other sad maternity tragedies at East Kent and at Nottingham, which long before there was an inquiry there. And you know, I've, as a journalist, looking at these issues as they've popped up elsewhere, we now know obviously problems at Leeds and in Oxford and other hospitals. And I was really sort of, you know, the Sunday Times likes to take a look at an issue and come at it a different way to try and think about what's not being reported. And you know, looking at the issues in all of those other scandals, the focus of journalists has always been, you know, the hospitals killing babies, harming mothers, causing tragedy and the heartbreak that is. And it's entirely right that journalists are highlighting that issue. But we wanted to look at something slightly different and maybe think about how we could get into it differently. Where's this starting from? And I think an issue that hasn't been looked at in any great depth, really, is the education of midwives, the education of student midwives, the quality of that education. And you know, are we setting up midwives to have the skills, the knowledge and the training that they will need? And, you know, it's interesting for me with the Shrewsbury inquiry, the Morecambe Bay inquiry, East Kent, Nottingham, you know, I've been involved with all of those inquiries and they were all not allowed effectively to look at education and training. You know, that was outside of their remit. These were health service related inquiries. And I think, I feel that we've missed a trick there as a system. We've let something go. And so I wanted to investigate the university side of things. And I'm afraid what we found is very troubling. So we looked at all the publicly available information about the maternity courses at more than 60 universities that train in the order of around 13,000 students. And we went through their curriculum details, the modules, the descriptions, effectively the ingredients and the shopping list of what they're going to train their students in. And we found more than 2/3 of these universities were openly, explicitly referencing the desire to train their students in the normal birth ideology. So there were phrases like, for example, this course is rooted in normality. This module will provide you with the skills to promote normality. There were even some universities promoting normality in complex care, which is something that I think people working in maternity and hospital units might find somewhat concerning. And so we looked at that, but we didn't just want to stop there. We spoke to lots of student midwives. We spoke to midwives working in the NHS. This is something we may want to come back to, but many of those people didn't want to talk openly and have their names published, which I think says a lot about the culture that we've got in maternity services. And we talked to the Royal College of Midwives. We looked at the funding of universities, the staff cuts that are going on in universities. And we also spoke to people like Marion Knight from Embrace, the confidential maternity inquiry into maternal deaths. Professor Knight is an expert in looking at what's happening to mothers and babies on the wards, and she was very clear that in the evidence that she sees, the case reports that she's looking at of people who have died, she was seeing cases of midwives who don't have the skills to look after the women that they're seeing in maternity at the moment. So she gave some examples of breathlessness in maternity being dismissed sometimes, of pain radiating down the arm, she said, was often dismissed as heartburn, whereas in a man, in his 40s or 50s, he'd be carted off straight to A&E with a suspected heart attack. And so she was saying these things are dismissed, and she was worried that the curricula isn't keeping pace with the demands that midwives might face in hospital now. And that's partly down to the demographics that we see in maternity now. Women are giving birth when they're older. They're giving birth after IVF, which can increase complication risks. They're going into hospital with conditions like diabetes and gestational diabetes and obesity and still smoking while giving birth, and a lot of factors that can raise your risk of complication. And I think it's important that I state right up front, we are not saying in this investigation that there is anything wrong with mothers wanting to have a normal, natural birth. Of course, that's something many women might want, they might seek, and there's nothing inherently wrong in that. There is even some evidence to suggest that might be, a good thing for their well-being, beneficial maybe to the baby. But the key thing is, and we've seen this in repeated inquiries into NHS failings now, is this sort of focus on that as an end goal for the midwife, and indeed for obstetricians as well. And that's the point. It's the over-focus on that ideology that can lead to some staff in some situations when the stars align in a tragic way, that they fail to listen to the mother, they fail to act when there's a warning sign, they just wait that bit too long, and we tip over into an emergency and into a crisis. And I think that's the point of this story. And we were asking the question, are universities still stuck in that kind of ideology, which in the NHS world, because of all the scandals, hospitals have I think, started to move away from that ideology and started to move away from this language of normal. I think the universities are some way behind that.
Well, thank you for setting out so clearly what you've been investigating, Shaun. And this is incredibly important. And you also had some really heartbreaking stories in your reporting as well. And it strikes me, listening to what you've just said, I mean, this comes on the back of a kind of decade of investigations into thousands of baby deaths in Britain. And we know that according to the Care Watchdog, 65% of maternity units still need to improve safety. So this is a really critical issue for us to get right. Would you mind sharing with us a story of one of the families that you wrote about in your piece? I was particularly struck by the story of Alex Barr and how she was not listened to when things started to go wrong. And that chimes so much with many of the stories that I read chairing the birth trauma inquiry in Parliament last year, that mothers knew something was wrong with their body, but they were actually being ignored by a healthcare professional. And I think that has pretty serious ramifications for their care. And as we've seen in extreme examples, has led to the deaths of babies in some instances. So could you just share with some of the kind of personal stories to better understand the scale of the problem?
Yeah, of course. And I think it's always important as a journalist that we listen to families and what they say, and we report what they say. And I think it's always important that people reading these stories and reacting to these stories appreciate, that it's not us, the journalists, coming up with these issues. It's bereaved mothers, it's families who are going through this, and they're the ones who are telling these stories. So with Alex, she's actually a great case study in this sense, because she was a specialist renal nurse. So she's very skilled in nursing and knows the NHS system, but unfortunately she was failed. And what happened to her is that she was nearly 42 weeks pregnant with her daughter Marnie when she went to hospital. She was developing some bleeding, and she went to hospital, wanted that checked over, and they had effectively dismissed her bleeding. So they felt that midwife noted that it was a show, for those who are familiar with that in maternity, as a sign of that she was going into labour, but it wasn't bleeding. Now, Alex, as I said, is a renal nurse. She knows the difference between a show and real blood. And she is convinced to this day that she was bleeding in hospital, but she was sent away. She had an elevated heart rate as well. And under the guidance that the midwife should have followed, she should have been seen by a doctor. She should have been reviewed, but she wasn't. And she was sent home. And our story begins actually with her arriving at home, sitting in her car. Her son is asleep on the back seat, and she's waiting there. She's anxious about Marnie. She's worried about what happened. She's worried that she's been sent home, and she suddenly feels this rush of warmth between her legs, and she pulls her hand away to see bright red blood. And she knew she was in serious trouble. And she's rushed back to hospital. She's by ambulance, but unfortunately, when they look for Marnie's heartbeat, they can't find it, and she's sadly died. Alex goes on to tell us that even after Marnie had been confirmed to have died, she was forced to give birth, she says, naturally. She wanted a cesarean section. She didn't want to go through that labour, but she said she felt bullied by the consultant to continue to go through that process. Now, there are reasons for that. There are potential guidance that says that might be beneficial, but mother's opinion should be taken into account in that moment, and she felt certainly that hers wasn't. And if you look deeper into their story or how they ended up in this situation, Alex talks to us in the article about in the weeks leading up to this, she had repeatedly raised concerns about the fact that her pregnancy was going on longer than perhaps she wanted. She asked for an induction. She wanted a sweep to maybe start the process. And when she raised this with the community midwife, she was told instead to go for a long walk and to try clary sage oil, which, for a clinician like Alice was kind of infuriating to her. And she says there is no evidence to support that advice that she was given. And tragically, she trusted the professionals that she sought advice from, and she waited, and she lost her daughter. And it's a terrible tragedy for them. The hospital trust, this is Poole Hospitals, they settled their case. Their clinical negligence came with a 6-figure payout earlier this year. And the couple, Alex and Stephen, they feel very strongly that a lot of what went wrong in their care was related to normal birth and this desire to kind of keep her waiting in the hope that everything would happen naturally, when really what should have happened is an intervention. She should have been reviewed by a doctor, and we can never really know what the outcome would be otherwise if we're trying to sort of we're into hypotheticals. But I think Alex feels very confident that had they listened to her, had they acted, had they intervened, that Marnie would be with them today. And I think that story is reflected in the stories we hear up and down the country time and time again from mothers and fathers. And it should give everyone working in maternity services should pause and think about what they do when they have a parent saying something's wrong, they don't feel it's right, and how do you respond to that? It's a crucial factor in most of the poor cases I sadly have to report on.
Well, firstly, it's devastating to hear that testimony, Shaun, from that family, and to any other family who's had an awful experience with their birth or something that's happened tragically afterwards. And that's why it's so important that we break the taboo by speaking about these subjects. So you made a really important point at the beginning of the episode where you talked about the curriculum for midwives. So if we could just talk a bit about the kind of university training for kind of the next generation of midwives. And I should add that the chief exec of the Royal College of Midwives, the RCM, has warned that universities should not be promoting an ideology, and said that they have raised serious concerns about the quality of university education for student midwives. So could you tell us a bit about that and what specifically you found that they were teaching that you didn't think was appropriate or diverged from guidelines?
Yeah, so it's important to say, we found this issue going on in 2/3 of universities. In other universities, we actually found quite clear reference to the training of midwives needing to respond to the abnormal, to know when to intervene, to know when to escalate to their obstetrician colleagues. And that's really positive. There are universities out there teaching the right things, but there were others teaching this idea that this wait and see normality approach, that the role of midwives is to avoid the cascade of interventions, as they reference, where the moment you start doing one thing, it leads to another, and we end up with a medicalised birth. There is some genuine reasons behind this, and I think Jill Walton from the Royal College of Midwives has explained it in the past around this pendulum swinging between normal births and medicalised births. And of course, we don't want an overly medicalised birth either. An unnecessary medicalised birth can cause trauma to the woman and baby and be, really unpleasant for people to go through. So there is a balance to be struck. But what I think we found in some of the curriculums and the modules was this emphasis that was being placed on normality and waiting and seeing and trying to keep the doctors at bay. And we spoke to, it's very difficult for me in my ivory tower at the Sunday Times to know exactly what is said in student lectures. So it was important to us to speak to students who were going through this process. And we did. And multiple students spoke to us on an off the record basis. Sadly, none of them could be named for fear of what their universities would do and do to them. But they all described the fact that from almost the moment they arrive, they are being taught about normality. Normality is the emphasis that they're given in the lectures. And a lot of the acute physiological skills that they need as clinicians, where it's recognizing when a woman is deteriorating, they actually said to me that they felt that was less important in some of the teaching. And some students talked about having aromatherapy promoted to them and things like that. And I think for me, what struck me was the variability. So it really did depend which universities you go to. And some universities not that far apart from each other have very different modules and curriculums. Now, they should all be meeting set standards by the Nursing and Midwifery Council. But a key problem in all of this that we found in our investigation was that the NMC, I'm afraid, has been marginally absent from regulating this field. There is a large number of lecturers out there with concerns about the NMC's ability to monitor what's going on. So it relies largely on self-assessment, self-reporting by universities. It's outsourced its quality assurance to a private company. And in fact, as we were getting close to publication and the NMC knew that our story was coming out, they wrote a letter to all universities in which that letter says about the fact that there are some universities whose courses have quote unquote deviated from the NMC's standards in a way that the NMC was unaware of or didn't approve. And so the NMC said to all universities, you've got 1 month to tell us about any deviations in your courses and what that results in. And they're taking a proactive approach now, but I'm not sure they would have done that had it not been for our story. And the NMC has acknowledged that there are student midwives who have been held back from graduating because they haven't met the standards and the competencies that the NMC requires. And I think that's really concerning. Students are paying a lot of money for these courses. The taxpayer is paying a lot of money for these courses. And yet they're not meeting the competencies that the NMC sets down. So there's a whole lot of problems going on in the university sector. And I think Jill Walton from the Royal College of Midwives, it was very clear that they've got concerns. They've got concerns about the quality of the placements the students are on, because, of course, they have to do 50% on placement in hospitals as well as on the course. There's self-learning. There's the support that students get. One student did say to us that there are cliques that they are aware of when they go on to placements, that they were aware of other students who had been bullied by midwives for taking a different approach, taking a different view. And we spoke to one midwife who had was worked first an intensive care nurse, but then trained as a midwife. And she said herself, this 20 years ago when she trained, it was all about normality. And I think there's this thread there. And as I said at the very beginning, normality isn't the only issue in maternity services, and I'm happy for us to chat about what some of the others are. But I think it's a thread running through this problem that we have in maternity services, and we've got to sort it out. We can't have ideology in this way. As a health journalist, I write about all aspects of healthcare, maternity and midwifery is the only area where I come up against a sort of ideology in the way that we do in maternity. It doesn't exist in other parts of healthcare. I think I find that really interesting, and there's something there that we need to explore and get behind.
Well, it's interesting to hear you describe, Shaun, how different the curriculums are. And if I could just add a positive example, I remember when I was the MP in Stafford, my local university in Staffordshire invited me to meet their year 2 midwives. And because I was a local MP, they'd been following the birth trauma inquiry in great detail. A number of the students were writing their dissertation about our recommendations and wanted to be kind of part of the change in the next generation to provide better care. So we certainly have some very good examples of care, and I think that's important to say. But I think your investigation is important to look at where there are failures and where we can improve it. So I suppose the key question then is, what is the government going to do about it? And we know that the Health Secretary has said he's going to work with the NHS to overhaul midwifery training. He's also separately warned that the kind of government's approach to maternity is failing to tackle what he called this kind of deeper malaise in the service, including training and ideas around normal birth. So what response have you had from the government, and what action are they taking to address this?
Yeah, I mean, we're still waiting for the details as always, but I think it's important that the Health Secretary came out with a very strong response, saying quite clearly that, first of all, students should be trained properly, that women should not be, effectively forced into what they called he called an ideal from an old ideal, I think was the phrase. And I think it's right that he's called that out. He has said he wants an overhaul of education and training of midwives. We don't know what that necessarily will look like. I suspect he's going to wait and see what Baroness Amos says in her current review that's looking at that. In the terms of reference for her review, it does say she's going to look at this idea of normal birth and its prevalence and whether or not that is impacting on maternity services, and also education and training. These are things that she is supposed to be looking at. She's got a lot to do, though, and I think whether or not she can get into this issue to any great depth and with any great rigor is something I think a lot of families are concerned about. She's got a very short timescale. If she's to stick to that, who knows? I have my doubts, but it's in there. It's supposed to be there. We know that NHS England and the chief nurse Duncan Barton is doing a strategy on nursing, and he will have to consider midwifery, I think, in response to all of these concerns that are bubbling up all the time. So I think people are alive to this, Theo. We know that they are thinking about it. I don't think we've seen yet what that might look like. As a result of the story, there was a debate online and in social media about, should midwives go back to the old way of training where they trained as an adult nurse first, and then did midwifery as a specialism after that. It's what a lot of countries around the world do, but I think the jury is out. I'm not sure what the evidence shows for that, but it's an interesting thing that a lot of people, including those in maternity, have said that to me, that they think there is something in there about being a nurse first and a midwife second, given the demographic problems that maternity is facing. We are not in the same place as we were in the 70s and 80s when the normal birth movement first emerged. So that's something to consider. The other option is making the course longer, 4 years. That's been talked about as well, so that we can get more of these things in. But whatever we do, I think the outcome has got to be midwives that feel in themselves they have the skills that they need to cope with whatever is coming through the doors in their maternity unit. I'm not sure that we can say that they do have that at the moment. And I think mothers have got to feel they're being cared for by clinicians who know what to do, are prepared to do it, and that there isn't any kind of ideological barriers to any decisions that they make. I think that's the crucial thing.
Well, I totally agree with that. And we want women in this country to feel safe and that they're going to have a good level of care in hospital and afterwards. And Shaun, you mentioned there about Baroness Amos's maternity investigation. And I'm afraid I agree with you. I think she was given far too big a remit and too short a time to uncover all the issues in maternity and find a way to resolve them. But we know that normal birth is, one part of a much bigger jigsaw puzzle on why maternity care is failing in the UK. So could you talk a bit about some of the other factors of why it is that you think maternity units across the country are being, I'm afraid, not good enough standard for the general public to use, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole podcast that goes on for 2 hours about this topic. Thea, there's so much to get into. If you spend any time looking at the reports into Shrewsbury or Morecambe Bay, even, 10 years ago, report was published. So we've known these issues for a long time, but they're all sorts of things, and they will be variable as well, depending on the unit. So, but the common things you always find, there are always staffing issues. There are always issues around shortages or staff not in the right place. There's not enough staff on the postnatal wards, too many in the delivery suite, not enough in the community. Continuity of carer was a big policy that was pushed by NHS England. It was actually quite harmful because we didn't have the numbers of midwives to do it safely. And so that's a big problem. One of the biggest, I think, is culture. And obviously, ideology plays a part of that, but it's not the only issue in culture. You also have to have a team working environment where, the older midwives respect the younger midwives, that student midwives feel they can go up to the older midwife and say, I've got a concern here. We've seen too many cases, including at inquests, where midwives have said they didn't speak up when they themselves had a concern. And even when you've got experienced midwives, if they don't feel that they can speak up to an obstetrician, that they can't cross that professional boundary, if you like, and escalate and call for help. We see all sorts of issues around the interpretation of fetal monitoring and the scans around that. The clinical negligence payouts for failure to respond to abnormal fetal heart rates is eye-watering. It really is a big problem. And I know there is work going on to look at how we can better improve some of these specific issues. But they add up. And I think this is the problem I find, is the leadership that we find in maternity units can be quite lacking. Often, this is across the board, actually, in the NHS, not just maternity, but we escalate people into management roles, often without giving them any real training or any real sort of detailed support as to how to actually be a leader. You just end up becoming a senior midwife and your next step is managing, and you may be a terrible manager. I would not profess to be a very good editor of the Sunday Times if I was elevated to that position. But we do that all the time, and we put the wrong people in the wrong jobs, and it can have really toxic effects on wards. If you find me a maternity unit, I'm pretty confident you will find some variation of all of those things, at different levels, pegged at different levels across, but they all add up. And that's what I think why we're in a situation where 2/3 aren't safe enough. Other issues around equipment. We hear all the time about equipment that's broke, equipment that's missing, the capital estate, midwifery departments that are leaking and falling apart. And, frankly, if you're going on to work every day in an environment that looks a bit decrepit, does that affect your outlook, your abilities, your desire to do a great job? I mean, I'm sure people wouldn't admit to that, but it must have some impact, I think, in terms of just the team environment. And as well, the number of births is going up in certain parts of the country. You will find huge demand on these maternity units. So they're under fire all the time. They're under fire from people like me, but they're under constant demand. And now from women who are scared, who are worried because of the headlines and because of the decade-long crisis that we've got in maternity. So, the list is huge for the challenges that are facing maternity departments. But I do say that none of these are insurmountable. It is actually the job of the NHS, the job of NHS leaders to meet these challenges. If you go into any A&E department, they're quite familiar with similar challenges, and they're having to make similar improvements. So this is it's part of the job to rise to these challenges. I think what we've got to do is find what is stopping that in some units. And I think some of the inquiries that we've got underway will help to do that. But I think Donna Ockendon's report, Bill Kirkup's reports, Marion Knight's work at Embrace, they do actually provide us with the recipes for a better, safer maternity service. And I think now the onus really has to be on NHS leaders, NHS England, to actually start doing some of this. And I think it's positive that the Health Secretary is chairing the National Task Force on Maternity. And, he has made it a central responsibility of himself. Quite brave, some might say, given the difficulties turning this around in the last 10 years. But he seems to want to do it. And that can only be a positive if it brings with it some energy and some drive to do this, because the money's been put in. I think NHS England invested a lot of money off the back of the Shrewsbury scandals. Maybe that's not enough. Maybe we're still short of staff, etc. All of these things continue to be debated, but we've got to start seeing some movement on this. We can't wait any longer for improvement, because the longer we do, the more parents will be bereaved. And, and I think it's tragic to think that there are other families like Alex Barr in our story going through that right now today, and nobody wants that. And so we've got to redouble our efforts, I think. And these kinds of stories that I'm writing in the Sunday Times and that other journalists are writing, it shouldn't be seen as the media beating up midwives and maternity. What it should be seen at is what it is, a call to arms to rise up and meet the challenge.
Well, thank you so much, Shaun. And I think that's a good place to bring the episode to a close. And I think you've laid out very clearly what some of the big challenges are in maternity care. Well, this is a topic that we'll be coming back to many times over the series as we continue to look at the campaign to improve maternity care and what can be done to help families to receive better care during pregnancy, during birth and post-delivery. So, Shaun, thank you so much for coming on the episode. If anyone's interested to read the full report and the investigation in the Sunday Times, do click on the show notes. And we will continue to raise these points with the government. We have various members of Parliament coming on the podcast this year. And I think it's rest assured, Shaun, to say that myself, Rosie Dufford MP and others will continue to make the case for funding for maternity, making sure that we have the right levels of staffing on our wards, because we want families to feel safe and that they can give birth in the UK. And clearly that's not the case at the moment. And I think we need to do a big step and a big push to rebuild trust, I think, within the NHS on maternity. Well, if you've enjoyed today's episode of Breaking the Taboo, please do rate the episode or write a comment on iTunes and Spotify. And please do share it with friends and family. We want to reach as many people as possible. So stay tuned for next week's episode of Breaking the Taboo. Bye-bye for now.